Practicing the PREMAC principle. This is Improving Practice Through Inquiry, One Teacher's Story, by Kelly Gustafson. Ban, a 7-year-old first-grade student in Ms. Batista's classroom, had been referred for intervention assistance. Ban was not completing the daily assignments during independent coursework. Miss Batista scheduled a time to meet with Ban and the guidance counselor, Mr. Trammell, to discuss the incomplete tasks. Ban was prompted to brainstorm a list of her interests and hobbies to serve as motivators and rewards to choose from when completed work was submitted to Miss Batista. Ban shared that she always enjoyed collecting stickers, coloring with crayons, and decorating her possessions with beads and jewels. Mr. Trammell and Miss Batista explained that Ban could choose to use her time wisely and complete the assigned tasks, which will result in a choice from the reward list. Miss Batista and Ban decided to set weekly goals to plan the number of daily assignments completed to meet the reward goal. They counted the number of missing assignments and set achievement goals for Ban. The first goal for week 1 detailed that Ban would complete 3 independent tasks for 3 consecutive days. When Ban completed her assignments to match her set goal, she could choose stickers, coloring time, or time at the craft table. Miss Batista worked with Ban to increase the number of daily tasks, as evidenced by the increase in the frequency of rewards. As Ban's goals increased, and as she continued to meet these goals, the number of reward experiences increased as well. To maintain the rate of independent tasks, Miss Batista, Mr. Trammell, and Ban reviewed the reward list every other week and added or removed motivators and experiences. As Ban's progress continued, Mr. Trammell met with her to create a game board that would serve as a visual chart to begin documenting her successes toward her goals. Ban and Mr. Trammell set an appointment time to meet weekly. At the weekly meetings, they reviewed her progress and charted it on the game board. Ban moved her game piece along the board as she accomplished her goals and earned rewards. Mr. Trammell's weekly meetings with Ban were consistent and served as a time to reflect and celebrate positive progress toward her academic achievement. Both the teacher and the guidance counselor considered Ban's engagement in determining her reinforcements to be the key factor in the success of the intervention. Kelly Gustafson is a former teacher. She is currently the principal at Bower Hill Elementary School in Venetia, Pennsylvania. Skinner argued that society too frequently uses averse means, particularly punishment, to shape desired behavior, rather than the more effective positive reinforcement. As you think about how your behavior has been shaped, would you agree or disagree? I think I needed punishment. Sorry. I believe I was born with a sin nature. Why do you think we use punishment so frequently? Because human nature is not a pretty thing. Take a stand. Positive reinforcement versus punishment as a classroom management tool. Common sense suggests that when one pedagogical technique is shown to be largely effective for achieving a particular objective and a second technique is shown to be largely ineffective, the former would be used by at least a sizable minority of teachers, while the latter would be ignored by most. Well, common sense does not always prevail, particularly in the case of using positive reinforcement and punishment as classroom management tools. As we've documented on these pages, few teachers use positive reinforcement in their classrooms, despite its demonstrated effectiveness in promoting desired behaviors. Various forms of punishment, which have numerous disadvantages, are more popular. One reason for this contrary state of affairs undoubtedly has to do with the decline in popularity of operant conditioning theory in educational psychology textbooks and courses. It is not unusual these days for students in teacher education programs to have learned little or nothing about operant conditioning principles and their classroom applications. As a result, many teachers fall into what is called the negative reinforcement trap. Here's how it works. A student's misbehavior instinctively elicits a punishing response from a teacher because punishment can be administered quickly and easily, and often produces a rapid, albeit temporary, suppression of the undesired behavior. Let's say the teacher sends the offending student to the principal's office. Having obtained at least temporary relief, the teacher is now more inclined to send the next misbehaving student to the office. Now let's examine this situation from the student's perspective. Some students may misbehave because they find the work boring, or, even worse, threatening because of a fear of failure. Sending such a student out of the room removes the student from a punishing environment. This is a form of negative reinforcement, which increases the likelihood that the student will engage in subsequent misbehavior. The best way to deal with this problem is to avoid it in the first place by using a combination of effective teaching methods and positive reinforcement, an approach that is referred to in the literature as positive behavior support. In our suggestions for teaching sections, we discuss several ways in which positive reinforcement can be used appropriately and effectively. Have you seen the type of situation described here during your own schooling? What do you think about it? Makes sense. Suggestions for teaching. Applying operant conditioning in the classroom. Remain aware that behavior is the result of particular conditions. Unlike the controlled environment of a Skinner box, many causes of behavior in a real-life classroom may not be observable or traceable. You might as well accept the fact, therefore, that quite often you are going to be a haphazard shaper of behavior. Nevertheless, there will be times when you and your students may benefit if you say to yourself, now, there have to be some causes for that behavior. Can I figure out what they are and do something about changing things for the better? Am I doing something that is leading to types of behavior that are making life difficult for some or all of us in the room? When you are engaging in such speculations, keep in mind that reinforcement strengthens behavior. Check to see whether you are inadvertently rewarding students for misbehavior by calling attention to them, for example, or by failing to reinforce those who engage in desirable forms of behavior. Examples: if you become aware that it takes a long time for your students to settle down at the beginning of a period, and that you are reacting by addressing critical remarks specifically to those who dawdle the longest, ignore the dawdlers and respond positively to those who are ready to get to work. Let's say that you have given students 30 minutes to finish an assignment. To your dismay, few of them get to work until almost the end of the period, and you find that you have to do a lot of nagging. When you later analyze why this happened, you conclude that you actually encouraged the time-killing behavior because of the way you set up the lesson. The next time you give a similar assignment, tell the students that as soon as they complete it, they can have class time to work on homework, and that you will be available to give help or advice to those who want it. Use reinforcement, and use it appropriately to strengthen behaviors you want to encourage. Why would we remind you to do something as obvious as reinforce behaviors you want students to acquire and exhibit in the future? Wouldn't you do that almost automatically? Well, we certainly hope so, but statistics suggest otherwise. A large team of researchers headed by John Goodland observed the classroom behavior of 1,350 teachers and 17,163 students in 38 schools from 7 sections of the country. What they found may surprise you. Teachers' praise of student work occurred about 2% of the observed time in the primary grades and about 1% of the time in high school. Once you have resolved to reinforce desired behavior systematically, you need to be sure that you do it appropriately. Although reinforcement is a simple principle that can be readily understood at an intuitive level, it has to be used in the right way to produce desired results. Paul Chance offers 7 guidelines for the effective use of positive reinforcement. Use the weakest reward available to strengthen a behavior. In other words, do not use material rewards when you know that praise will be just as effective a reinforcer. Save the material rewards for that special behavior for which praise or other reinforcers may not be effective. When possible, avoid using rewards as incentives. What chance means is not to get into the habit of automatically telling the student that if she does what you want, you will provide a specific reward. Instead, sometimes ask the student to do something like work quietly or help another student, and then provide the reinforcer. Reward at a high rate in the early stages of learning, and reduce the frequency of rewards as learning progresses. Reward only the behavior you want repeated. Although you may not realize it, students are often very sensitive to what is and is not being reinforced. If you decide that one way to encourage students to be more creative in their writing is to tell them not to worry about spelling and grammar errors, then don't be surprised if you see a number of misspelled words and poorly constructed sentences. Or if you decide to reward only the 3 highest scorers on a test, reasoning that competition brings out the best in people, be prepared to deal with the fact that competition also brings out some of the worst in people, like cheating and refusing to help others. Remember that what is an effective reinforcer for one student may not be for another. For some students, comments such as "very interesting point," or "that's right," or "that was a big help," will strengthen the target behavior. But for others, something less overt, such as smiling encouragingly, may be just right. This is what we meant in Chapter 1 when we said that part of the art of teaching is knowing your students well enough that you know what to do with which student for any particular situation. Set standards so that success is a realistic possibility for each student. You may have students whose English proficiency is limited or who have disabilities related to learning and intellectual functioning. One way to deal with such diversity is to reward students for making steady progress from whatever their baseline level of performance was at the beginning of the term. An often mentioned goal of teachers is to have students become intrinsically motivated or to take personal pride and satisfaction in doing something well. In simply doing something well. You can use natural instructional opportunities to point this out. For example, explore with students how satisfying it is to write a clear and interesting story as they are writing. Take advantage of knowledge about the impact of different reinforcement schedules to encourage persistent and permanent learning. When students first attempt a new kind of learning, supply frequent reinforcement. Then supply rewards less often. When students first try a new skill or type of learning, praise almost any genuine attempt, even though it may be inept. As they become more skillful, reserve your praise for especially good performances. Avoid a set pattern of commenting on student work. Make favorable remarks and unpredictable intervals. If you want to encourage periodic spurts of activity, use a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. Occasionally, you will want to encourage students to engage in spurts of activity, as steady output might be too demanding or fatiguing. In such cases, supply reinforcement at specified periods of time. For example, when students are engaging in strenuous or concentrated activity, circulate and provide praise and encouragement by following a set pattern that will bring you in contact with each student at predictable intervals. Give students opportunities to make overt responses and provide prompt feedback. Require students to make frequent, overt, and relevant responses. The tendency of teachers is to talk, and for large chunks of time. Those who advocate an approach to teaching based on operant conditioning principles recommend that teachers limit the amount of information and explanation they give to students and substitute opportunities for students to respond overtly. If you recall the operant conditioning principles we discussed earlier in the chapter, you'll understand the reason for this recommendation. Students have to do or say something before you can use reinforcement, extinction, or punishment to either strengthen desired behaviors or weaken undesired behaviors. Examples: instead of lecturing for 20 to 30 minutes at a time about the development of science and technology in the 20th century, Present information in smaller chunks, perhaps 8 to 10 minutes at a time, and then ask students to describe how an everyday product or service grew out of a particular scientific principle. Periodically ask students to summarize the main points of the material you presented over the past several minutes. Provide feedback so that correct responses will be reinforced and students will become aware of and correct errors. Research clearly shows that students who study material about a topic, answer a set of questions about that material, and then are told whether their responses are correct and why, score significantly higher on a subsequent test of that material than do students who receive no feedback. The difference was about 3/4 of a standard deviation, meaning that students who received feedback scored about 27 percentile ranks higher than students who received no feedback. This makes feedback one of the most important, powerful influences on achievement. While giving students information about the adequacy of their responses may seem like a fairly simple and straightforward matter, rest assured that it's not. Like most aspects of teaching, the devil is in the details. Your first challenge is to make sure that students attend to, understand, and know how to use the feedback you provide. When teachers address their feedback to the entire class or to a group of students, some students are bound to think that the teacher's comments don't apply to them. In addition, they may not understand what to do with the information if they don't have a clear idea of what type of behavior the teacher is looking for them to exhibit. So make sure your instructional objectives are clear, and that to the extent necessary, your feedback is tailored to one or a small group of students. Once these hurdles have been overcome, you then have to decide what type of types of feedback to give. What type or types of feedback? The type of feedback that most teachers provide is the most common, telling students whether their response was correct or incorrect, what they did well, and where they made mistakes. But there are other types of feedback that you can provide. Whether you decide to go further will depend on your instructional objectives. If you want students to become more effective learners and better problem solvers, your feedback has to be directed at the cognitive processes that they used that led them to respond as they did. Here are a couple of examples of how you can provide timely and useful feedback to students. Ramona, you answered most of the knowledge level questions on this reading assignment correctly, so that aspect of your study skills seems to be in good shape. But your answers to the items that ask you to provide relevant examples and applications of the concepts in the passage usually weren't accurate. That suggests that we need to work on improving your reading comprehension and transfer skills. Noah, the ideas in your last writing assignment were interesting and well thought out, but you didn't meet my standard for an A paper because there were too many misspellings and grammatical errors. Let's talk about steps you can take to proofread and correct your errors before you turn in the next assignment. When students must struggle to concentrate on material that is not intrinsically interesting, use special forms of reinforcements to motivate them to persevere. For a variety of reasons, some students may have an extraordinarily difficult time concentrating on almost anything. And, as we all know, to master almost any skill or subject, we have to engage in a certain amount of tedious effort. Here are some behavior modification techniques that may help. Select with student assistance a variety of reinforcers. A behavior modification approach to motivation appears to work most successfully when students are aware of and eager to earn a payoff. Because students react differently to rewards and because any reward is likely to lose its effectiveness if used to excess, it is desirable to list different kinds or several kinds of rewards and permit students to choose. Some behavior modification enthusiasts even recommend that you make up a reinforcement preference list for each student. If you allow your students to prepare individual reinforcement menus themselves, they should be instructed to list school activities they really enjoy doing. It would be wise, however, to stress that the students' lists must be approved by you so that they will not conflict with school regulations or interfere with the rights of others. A student's reward menu might include activities such as reading a book of one's choice, working on an art or craft project, or viewing a videotape or DVD in another room. Establish in consultation with individual students an initial contract of work to be performed to earn a particular reward. Once you have established a list of payoffs, you might consult with students on an individual basis, if possible, to establish a certain amount of work that must be completed for students to obtain a reward selected from the menu. To ensure that students will earn the reward, the first contract should not be too demanding. For example, it might be something as simple as successfully spell at least 7 out of 10 words on a list of previously misspelled words, or correctly answer at least 6 out of 10 questions about the context of a textbook chapter. The content of a textbook chapter. Once the initial reward is earned, establish a series of short contracts leading to frequent, immediate rewards. The results of many operant conditioning experiments suggest that the frequency of reinforcement is of greater significance than the amount of reinforcement. Therefore, having students work on brief contracts that lead to frequent payoffs immediately after the task is completed is preferable to having them work through a delayed king-size reward. Work toward a delayed king-size reward. Challenging assumptions. Reward is in the eye of the beholder. So, says Celeste, we can't assume that a desirable stimulus for one student will be desired or desirable for all. Right, says Don, and even if a kid's behavior does, from our point of view, improve, we can't be sure that it will work the same way in all situations. So if we can never be sure what will and will not be a positive reinforcer, how does behavioral learning theory help us figure out what to do in our classrooms? Good question, said Connie. She returns to Antonio. What do you think? I think it's really critical to know your students, says Antonio, to know what works for each of them, and to know what works one day may not work the next. I mean, every day, every lesson is an experiment. Going into the lesson, you have an idea of what might work, so you conduct your experiment and watch your kids' behavior to see if the experiment worked. Celeste picks up on Antonio's mention of the scientific method. So you develop a hypothesis. If we do X in this lesson, then Y, some learning, should occur. You test your hypothesis by teaching the lesson. You collect data. You observe student behavior in the environment to determine whether your hypothesis is supported or not. She continues, now it is at this point, when you analyze your data and draw conclusions, that operant principles can be most helpful. They help you figure out what happened. I see where you're going, says Don. You can't know whether some change you make in a student's environment is reinforcement or punishment until you see the effect on the student's behavior. You have to observe behavior to see whether it is strengthened or weakened. The three of them are nodding together, and they go on to analyze additional examples for 40 minutes. The meeting finally draws to a close. On her way home, Connie smiles as she thinks, these meetings present very desirable stimulation. I think I'll come back next week.